They thought they hit rock bottom, but then came a knock from below. That is the current state of the Russian economy. A tsunami of inflation, the near total end of mortgages, and the death of Russian business along with the banking sector. The war has destroyed everything. Putin left the country with a big fat zero in the budget. Even the resurrection of Nabiullina did not help. About the colossal collapse of the economic sector in Putin's federation right now. Welcome everyone to our channel. Joining us today is Vyacheslav Shiryaev, an economist. Vyacheslav, hello.
Hello.
And I would like to start our interview today with the topic of the mortgage crisis and the threat of a 2008 scenario. Now, I will tell you more specifically which one. According to European intelligence cited by European Pravda, Russian bank balances are now artificially inflated, as the publication writes. And to attract money somehow, they lowered risk assessment standards and began mass distributing subsidized mortgages, which pushed real estate prices to the max, really significantly. And Western intelligence agencies are explicitly warning about the risk of such a bubble forming and a wave of defaults. So tell me, does this mean that in Russia, well, any moment now, we might see a repeat of the famous American mortgage crisis of 2008, when the bubble bursts and people are left without apartments and essentially without money?
Well, it was not just in America. Russia has already experienced this crisis in the housing market. But let's start with the fact that the housing market crisis America and Russia faced in 2008 and 2009 is nothing compared to the crisis awaiting Russia in the coming months. Because at the time, when the mortgage crisis hit the West and construction projects suddenly stopped all across Russia, Russia was fortunate to have huge financial reserves that Kudrin had been carefully stashing away for quite a long time. Russia could support developers, Russia could support banks, inject money there because there was the National Wealth Fund. And this even allowed Russia, for example, to actively support the stock market. Few people remember this now, but when the exchanges and financial markets began to experience noticeable declines and started falling due to the crisis you mentioned earlier, there were voices heard saying, let's support the stock market. So the Russian government, through its various institutions, would step in and start buying up shares, thus providing support and essentially keeping them from falling further. Imagine, Russia had the money back then to buy shares so they would not drop too much. That was the state Russia was in back then. After the 2000s, after high oil prices, when oil cost $110 to $120 a barrel for a very long time. Those were different dollars. They were worth twice as much as the dollars are today. So $60 a barrel now is like $30 a barrel back in the 2000s. And that's why they were able to contain that crisis. Yes, prices fell. Yes, construction was frozen. Yes. Thousands, tens of thousands of people were left without homes or money. Remember the tragedy of foreign currency mortgage holders. Many people took out foreign currency mortgages, but the rate jumped 1.5 to 2 times. And so people didn't have the money or income to service those mortgages denominated in foreign currency. But back then, they somehow got out of it. The world began to recover from the shock. In America, they printed trillions of dollars, quantitative easing. We all remember that story. And slowly things began to stabilize. Oil prices rose, and Russia began to crawl out of the crisis without any effort of its own, so to speak. And this is definitely not what's going to happen in Russia now, because the state has no money for anything. The state is simply bankrupt. And yesterday, I read the laments of stock market participants about why Russia isn't supporting the falling stock market. Why doesn't the Russian government buy up some shares of Gazprom, Sberbank, coal companies, or steel makers to support the market and keep them from falling further? And they all answer their own question, because the Russian government has no more money. None. The same thing awaits the housing market. It's going to crash very hard and catastrophically, because sales of new buildings have dropped by half. The movement forum just ended in Sochi, where about 5,000 real estate market participants gathered, those who build and those who sell apartments. I just spoke with someone who was at that forum. Well, first of all, the keynote speaker from the company Dom.rf. There's this mortgage company in Russia that handles all the mortgage programs. It's called Dom.rf. It's headed by Mutko, a friend of Putin's. So at this forum, a representative of Dom.rf was the keynote speaker. He gave his speech absolutely drunk. I was also told he was on drugs. I mean, the man had completely lost his human appearance. He would pause for 40 seconds at a time. He couldn't formulate a single thought. And to me, that's the best sign of what's happening with the housing market in the Russian Federation. If the keynote speaker showed up completely wasted to a panel discussion at this huge forum, 5,000 people sitting there listening to a drunk man. And the next day, the Deputy Minister of Housing and Construction came out and said, well, you've probably seen the last of this man, implying that he should be fired. But then Mutko called, the Minister of Construction and said, no, this guy is mine. He's at Domdaref, not at the Ministry of Construction. So please tell your deputies not to say anything about my people there. And they rolled it back. That's what's happening with the housing market. Here's a little sketch for you. But this was a convention not even of housing market resuscitators, because reviving it is pointless. They are powerless to resuscitate it. It's like a burial squad. So all the people who gathered in Sochi, they admitted that the housing market is a goner, excuse the pun. A twofold drop in housing sales volume wouldn't be sustained even by a healthy market. And healthy developers in good financial standing wouldn't have survived such a drop in sales volume. And here we're dealing with bankrupts, with zombies. Look at the state of the Samalet company, for example, the largest developer, which has already defaulted twice on its obligations. Look at the financial situation and the debt levels of other developers. You'll see that buying apartments in Russia is madness. These apartments won't be finished. These apartments will go to the banks, and the banks will then dump them for half the price. Yes, but the most important thing is the speech by the developer's representative. It's called, this company is called, this developer is called Strana Development. So this person said, I have a direct quote right here. So look, nothing is selling for us. As an experiment, mind you, as an experiment, we tried lowering prices by 20%. Still nothing is selling. So we put the prices back up by 20%, raised them back because it doesn't sell either way. There's no difference at all. So the point, everyone asks, why aren't prices falling? Why are prices so high and not falling in the primary market? Because it's pointless. Even if you lower prices, you still won't sell anything. So the housing market crisis is an inevitability. Absolutely amazing things are happening with mortgages. Russia has no more money to support subsidized mortgages. Subsidized mortgages were the last thing supporting the housing market. When a family with a child could take out a loan at 6%, not at 20%. And 14% was supposed to be paid by the state, the budget. Well, there's no more money in the budget. The Kommersant newspaper wrote that as of July 1st, there are discussions in the government that mass subsidized mortgages will be canceled and 6% will only be left for families with 3 children and a 50% down payment. Are there many such families in Russia? So essentially, we're dealing with the cancellation of subsidized mortgages. Yes, in all other cities, they'll raise the rate to 12% in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and in other regions to 10% for the subsidized rate subsidized. The non-subsidized regular market rate is 20%, 19 plus or minus, and the only place where the 6% mortgage will still apply is in hard-to-reach Arctic regions, the Far East, where naturally, even with a mortgage like that, you can't lure anyone in. So it's completely painless for the budget. Nothing's going to be bought or sold there anyway. No one's going there. And developers are now making one last-ditch effort just to somehow hold on for a bit, a month or two, so they don't collapse right tomorrow. They're starting new projects. Imagine, it would seem like madness. You've got nothing selling, yet you start launching new sites in Chelyabinsk, in Yekaterinburg. Why are they doing this? To collect at least a little more money from these deceived suckers who will rush, at low prices to buy foundation pits, hoping that some house will be built here and they'll bring more money into the company's coffers. And the company will be able to survive for a little while longer. This is the very dangerous game developers have started, opening new projects in a falling market. But it's a pure pyramid scheme. All the people in Russia who are currently thinking about whether or not they should buy an apartment, well, naturally, these are the kinds of people who honestly, really just lack brains after all.
And so last time we talked more about the federal budget, and now I'd like to look at the situation in the provinces as a whole. Because also in that same intelligence report, it stated that regional debts are now being forcibly shifted onto Russian banks. And financial institutions are forced to cover the difficulties of the Russian Federation's entities with loan repayments. And at the same time, the state only saves the defense industry. Yeah, somehow at least it tries. And the ordinary citizen with civilian business, it's like left alone with its problems, like figure it out yourself. And how quickly will such an imbalance, lead to a commodity shortage and mass closure of ordinary factories and businesses that don't sew uniforms? Military ones don't work for the Russian army and don't produce shells, but just basic Russian business like that.
Well, in order to analyze the situation in the banking sector, First, you need to understand the fundamental difference of banking business in Russia from some American banking business. There, the banking system is autonomous. Well, that is, it's an independent business that relies on lending to private business, on savings of pensioners, ordinary citizens, putting money into circulation, earns on the stock exchange, and so on. It's a stable system. The state is separate, the banking sector is separate. And when in America or somewhere in some European country or in Japan, a bank gives money to the state or a state, it doesn't matter, well, to those in power, then it's an honest relationship. And we say that, yes, indeed, the banking system is ready to support at a normal interest rate, gives a loan or buys treasuries or something else. And here, well, the government gets some resource for temporary use, pays interest, and solves some of its problems. In Russia, it's all different. The banking system is an extension of the Kremlin, an extension of power. Essentially, there are two entities, the region and the bank, and there's the Kremlin. And the Kremlin tells the bank, give money to this region. So essentially, nothing is actually happening at that moment, just moving empty candy wrappers from one pocket to another. Because the banking system, it only stays afloat thanks to the central bank's printing press and repo operations, which allow the banking system to exist and not collapse yet. Naturally, when banks are given printed wrappers, the banks do exactly what they're told. If they're told to give money to some region alone, they'll give it. If they're told to give it to a defense industry enterprise, they'll give it. If they're told to write off debts, for those signing a contract for the special military operation, banks will write them off naturally. Therefore, the system as a whole is bankrupt, and figuring out where the hole is bigger in the banking sector or in regional budgets or in the federal center, well, I don't see much point. We can just watch this hole flowing from one corner to another. There's this black hole, and it's like, a drop of mercury flowing around. It flows into one corner, then into another. But it keeps expanding and expanding, swallowing everything alive around it. And basically, it doesn't make any difference anymore where this hole is at its largest right now. It's huge and unmanageable everywhere. And in regional budgets, there will be a 3 to 4 trillion budget deficit by the end of the year. And in the banking sector, tens of trillions of rubles, that's the hole. And the banking sector will never return those tens of trillions because they've been eaten up, they've been burned in the furnace of war. And accordingly, the federal budget will have a deficit of over 10 trillion by the end of 2026. And you can mask it for a while. Yeah? It's called the alleged reporting of banks. That is, banks can pretend that there's no hole, that we consider these loans to be like normal. Well, according to our balance sheet, they kind of exist, this money. But you can only pretend for so long, and then comes the moment when people want to withdraw their money. At that point, the state will have to print another few trillion, then another few trillion. And hyperinflation naturally will eat up all those wrappers that people pull out of the banks. Now, I don't think there will be an outright freeze at some point. I've said it 100 times. There's simply nothing to freeze. That money doesn't exist. So you either have to limit it for some technical reasons, tell people that, either the ATM is broken or your money is somehow fraudulent, prove the honest origin of this money. Or just print it and hand it out so that hyperinflation drives prices up several times, and people would realize that their million has turned into 200, 300,000 rubles or 100,000 rubles. So the problem with bank assets is not just about the regions. Well, naturally, they'll give some money to the regions at 20, 25% annual interest, and the regions will survive for a while longer. But still, this problem, it will come out in the fact that the regions did pay the doctors' salaries after all, but suddenly the doctors went to the store and saw that bread or, say, sour cream or eggs have gone up in price by 1.5 times. Or they paid the salaries. So the drivers went to the gas station and saw that gas is 1.5 times more expensive. So what's the beauty, so to speak, of this scheme? What's the catch? No, there is no advantage to such a strategy. It's just moving a hole from one place to another.
And so we have an interesting tradition starting here because if I'm not mistaken, we ended our last interview with a person like Nabiullina, and this interview, the third question prepared, is also about her, as new information has appeared. And so publications have noticed her recent, return. Actually, yes, because last time we...
Resurrection. I wrote that it was a resurrection.
Well, yes, you could say that. Right, and so she did return, yes, and at that time Vladimir Putin, while she was gone, Vladimir Putin demanded to lower the key rate, claiming that inflation was supposedly falling. And so she returned, and Nabiullina lowered the rate by only 25 basis points to 14.25%, admitting that she cannot do it quickly because of, well, high inflation risks. Even though it's already there, well... And what is this in your opinion? Is this such an open confrontation between the central bank and the Kremlin? Or is this such a regulator, she, yes, in the role of a regulator trying to save these remnants of the economy despite Putin's whims?
No, she's not doing anything, not saving anything anymore. She was told to lower it, she lowers it. She'll be told to print, she'll print. This is no longer the Nabiullina who could keep the markets in some kind of stable position, preventing panic among professional participants of the stock market, the financial market. No, she just does what she's told, despite the fact that, naturally, there isn't a word of truth in what she said at the press conference. It's all a lie from start to finish. All these findings, all these conclusions that she voiced, it simply does not correspond to reality. And inflation, even the official one, is already there. Their weekly one is 0.15%. So it's out of control again. But these are just the early signs. First of all, the real inflation that people observe is many times higher. For the spring months, inflation was 4.5%. The real one that people felt, so by the end of the year, it's already around 20. But what awaits Russia in the coming weeks and months, it's not even an inflationary, some kind of spike. It's a tsunami. Everyone understands everything perfectly. I'm even more interested in what she, for example, will do in July or in August, when it will be clear to everyone that inflation is accelerating, inflation is out of control, that money printing and the fuel crisis are finishing off financial stability. It's going to be fun when the real confrontation actually begins. They'll keep telling her to lower the rate even further, but she really needs to raise it to, say, 20% at least, to do something about inflation, to prevent the most, well, unpleasant consequences, to put it mildly. Well, we'll see how she behaves then. But for some reason, I think she just doesn't care anymore. She realized she won't get out of this mafia alive, and she'll do what she's told. So there's no more talk of any central bank independence. If they let her raise the rate while inflation is rampant, and that's July and August, raise it, not lower it. Well, maybe first she'll stop the reduction once. She'll say, no, we're not lowering anything this time. Then next time she'll raise it. Then I'll see she's still an interesting character worth watching further. Maybe she still has some potential, to object to those above. But I have huge doubts. She's not the same Nabiullina anymore.
Well, in any case, we'll keep watching all the events. Vyacheslav, thank you very much for the interview. It was a pleasure talking to you. See you soon.
All the best. Take care. Goodbye.